Good morning and happy new year. Thank you for joining us here on The Real Story. I'm Emma Wulfhorst. 2025 is going to be a big year politically, and not just this year, even just this month. Take a look here at what's coming up. Friday, the new U.S. Congress was sworn in, and back here at the Connecticut Capitol, Governor Lamont will give his State of the State address, laying out his proposals for the next two-year budget. We'll have live coverage of that for you through the next day when Connecticut lawmakers head back into the chambers, picking up the pieces of a short session which left lots of policy behind, as well as officially getting new bills on the books and starting the budget process. Then President-elect Trump will have his second inauguration January 20th. We'll have special coverage coming not only from D.C., but from communities right here in Connecticut preparing for Trump to take office. So let's talk about that new Congress President-elect Trump will work with. The 119th Congress is now officially sworn in and started back on Friday. They've got a lot to do, electing new leaders and getting ready for cabinet vetting and confirmation hearings. Plus, the government is only temporarily funded right now through March, so they have to get on with their own budget process. A reminder here, there was a lot of shakeup with some of the big names we've become accustomed to unseated this past election. Republicans have a majority in both chambers, but a slim one, which will make passing legislation difficult. Here in Connecticut, our Capitol Hill representation was completely reelected, some with even larger margins than past elections. Senator Chris Murphy kept his seat, now starting a new 6-year term. All 5 of our U.S. House representatives are headed back as well, which means these incumbents have higher ranking positions, more influence in their committees and caucuses. So what do the people we've elected do down in D.C.? What are their priorities and positions of power? We'll start with the 1st Congressional District. That's Representative John Larson. He's been on the oldest committee in Congress for a while now, the Ways and Means, in charge of tax writing and tax revenue services. Larson's focus has and continues to be Social Security. As the program dries up quicker and quicker, the new Congress will have to find some sort of solution. Larson's plan for reforms is the same one President Biden has endorsed. U.S. Representative Joe Courtney is perhaps best known for his work in our state's Navy base and submarine industry. He's taken on much of the work to better quality of life, benefits, and programs for military students, active duty, and veterans. But as far as defense as a business, it's a major part of our own statewide workforce and revenue. Representative Courtney works on air, sea, and land developments, along with security PAC investment and ally support, plus the necessary job pipelines like building up trade and manufacturing education. He pairs that with work on the Education and Workforce Committee overall, leading policy in higher ed, federal funding for classrooms, and labor pensions. Now, U.S. Representative Rosa DeLauro is keeping her position as one of the most powerful in the U.S. House's national investment conversations. Not only is she a leader in the party's proposal drafting, but she's a ranking member on the overall Appropriations Committee. Those are the people who draft and negotiate budgets. DeLauro specifically focuses on federal funding when it comes to things which fall under labor, education, and health and human services, which is quite a lot. Let's talk next about Congressman Jim Himes. His biggest seat is ranking on the Intelligence Committee. That not only means he's reviewing the government's operations, including covert ones, and the transparency of communicating what they know to us, but it also means he's getting highly confidential briefings on national security interests and international events. Beyond his duties there, Himes also works on the Financial Services Committee for businesses and family supports. He's also focusing on energy costs, reliability, and sustainability. He tells us entrepreneurship and infrastructure are going to be his big issues this year. Connecticut did see a lot of infrastructure funding through the Biden administration, some of the highest amounts of any state in the country. But with concerns that will now end with the next administration, Himes tells us he's looking at securing that funding and developing more innovative, people-first construction. and the former Teacher of the Year turned Congresswoman Jahana Hayes. With her leadership on the Education and Workforce Committee, she looks at classroom resources, education employment, and employment after education. She is also a powerful voice on the Agriculture Committee, representing not only her district, but our state's large industry and farm routes through the annual Farm Bill process and in other policy packages. She's a ranking member on the Nutrition Subcommittee, which also includes foreign agriculture and horticulture. She's involved in livestock, dairy, and poultry too, advocating for those struggling businesses and their federal grants to innovate and survive climate disasters. So what about the other chamber, the Senate? Chris Murphy will remain in office and has garnered national attention post-election, calling for new and tougher conversations within his party. These are 6-year terms, so there's a lot of work being carried over and a lot of work we don't necessarily see for a while. Take a look here at his official seats. The HELP Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. You can think of that as a really domestic worker focused committee, rights, protections, and support, and then international issues. Murphy chairs the counterterrorism subcommittee, which also works with some parts of Asia's governments. He's also on appropriations with DeLauro, but on the Senate side. His jurisdiction for federal funding is chairing the Homeland Security sector. He has many projects outside of these committee assignments as well, like what he's become known for, gun violence prevention, and even community building grants and programs to fight the so-called loneliness epidemic. And now Senator Richard Blumenthal, who's held his seat since 2011. He wasn't on your ballot this past election, though. That's because he isn't up for re-election until 2028. As a senior member in D.C., he definitely has a lot going on. Security and Cooperation in Europe Committee, Armed Services, and Homeland Security Governmental Affairs. Big security decisions, policy, and price proposals are decided in those rooms. Perhaps what he's become best known for is chairing many judiciary hearings you've seen over the past year, like the one with all the big tech CEOs or the Coast Guard Academy students who are subject to sexual harassment and assault. He's also on the Special Committee on Aging. Senator Blumenthal tells us these assignments and his role in hearings with some of the largest executives, officials, and experts is about accountability. He wants more of that in the new Congress, especially when it comes to the digital space.
One of my major priorities is going to be making social media safer. I have every intention of reintroducing and relaunching the Kids Online Safety Act, which will provide tools for young people and their parents to take back their lives online and impose a duty of care on social media. Looking ahead, I think the overriding message as we begin this session is both sides of the aisle need to come together, work together, and produce results together, get things done.
Now, from big tech to international aid spending and defense budgets and so much more in between, these are often large, complicated conversations in Congress with lots of disagreement and division. Usually, there's also no easy solution or one-page bill to fix the problem. We caught up with Congressman Courtney last week about an issue brought to him directly by the people he represents. The town of Scotland, where there are 6 zip codes for just about 600 people. What might seem like a small issue for Congress in the grand scheme of things for one town became a unanimous vote for change. That small zip code problem has caused issues from mail services to school registration and more.
Almost a comical situation. It's so outlandish to have basically, it's actually 6 zip codes. And for a community of that size, but it has real life impact in terms of the fact that the mail is still an essential service.
It turns out there are a lot of other small towns across the U.S. with a similar issue. Since constituents wrote to their lawmakers, called them, told them what a hassle this has been, it elevated this all the way to the U.S. House floor. That's where 2 outspoken lawmakers who don't usually work together co-sponsored the legislation and led it to a unanimous passing with Congressman Courtney, conservative Lauren Boebert, and progressive Jamie Raskin.
Those are two people who are about as far apart on the political spectrum as you can find. But again, it was a love fest, on the floor when the bill was brought up. We live at a time where people have gotten very skeptical, in some cases cynical, about what actually moves Congress. We live in a world, let's face it, with lots of lobbyists and super PACs and groups that go on TV and run ads to try and influence legislation in Congress. I mean, this is really kind of the old-fashioned Schoolhouse Rocks kind of version of Congress, where the town of Scotland has not hired a lobbyist. They don't have a PAC. They just went to their member of Congress and member of the Senate, because Chris Murphy is working on a companion bill in the Senate to really fix a problem.
And in a historically divided Congress, that was a moment of hope and decisive action in the final days of session. This also shows how paying attention and contacting your lawmakers' offices, from federal to state and even your local community, does inform their proposals, priorities, and what they fight for. We've gone over the new Congress, but what about the new state legislative session starting right here in Hartford? Well, on your screen here is how to see the schedule and find potential new laws, especially when public hearings start. Connecticut, as a state, requires lawmakers to hear testimony from anyone who wants to give it for any proposal. This year is a longer session, which means a few extra weeks to pass laws, but also more time because of the budget process. We're getting a new 2-year budget, which will be drafted over the next few months here. As far as the balance of power, Democrats held on to the majority in both the state Senate and state House, but for the first time, they received enough members to override Governor Ned Lamont's vetoes, a complete mandate, though Democratic leaders say they think they'd hesitate to ever really flex that power. When it comes to priorities, you can expect to see a lot of the same discussions, debates, and protests as last year. The budget battle will once again be over fiscal guardrails and how much Connecticut can and should spend of our historic surplus. The difference this time, state lawmakers could change those guardrails and give more to nonprofits, schools, and even tax breaks and credits. Connecticut's colleges and university want some of that money too, but lawmakers say they should have planned to not have temporary pandemic-era federal funding. Of course, energy and utility bills will be something both parties want to solve as well. We'll likely see early proposals from state money to electric reliability projects and the future of offshore wind. Those are some of the pocketbook policies we've been covering and will continue to monitor here, but there's so much more, and it definitely can be overwhelming. Fox 61 and The Real Story want to help. We have continuous coverage of how this will impact you, but for now, I want to take a quick look back at this past week's roundup of January 1st laws, which just went into effect. Good news for Connecticut workers. The state's minimum wage will increase January 1st from $15.69 to $16.35 an hour. This comes from a 2019 state law that requires the minimum wage be adjusted each year based on the U.S. Department of Labor's Employment Cost Index.
People who are working 2 and 3 jobs can cut back on the number of jobs they work. We know that minimum wage workers have to work 2 and 3 jobs just to make enough money to pay the bills.
And more workers will now be eligible for paid sick days. Beginning January 1st, nearly all workplaces with at least 25 employees will be required to provide up to 40 hours of paid sick leave every year. Some seasonal employees and other temporary workers are exempt. This law will eventually expand further and apply to workplaces with at least 11 employees in 2026 and those with at least 1 employee come 2027.
Everybody gets sick. Everybody deserves the time to care for themselves or for their loved one, no matter what kind of job they have, no matter how small their employer is, or whether they work full-time or part-time.
Those in the home health care industry will also see more safety protections in the new year. This law comes after visiting nurse Joyce Grayson was killed in October 2023 while caring for a patient at a halfway house in Willimantic. The measure includes more disclosures about clients' histories of violence or abuse and requires the Connecticut Department of Social Services establish a home health worker safety grant program to fund emergency training, panic buttons, a dedicated emergency hotline, a buddy escort system, and GPS tracking for workers.
If she had had that device where she could have pushed that button so that the whole neighborhood maybe could have heard that something was happening, I have to think, yes, it would help her.
Again, there are a lot of new laws and even more to keep track of with the legislative session starting this Wednesday, the new Congress already at work, and Trump's inauguration later this month. So be sure to find us on the web, on YouTube, on streaming, or on our Fox 61 News app. You can head to the Real Story tab at the top of your screen. Still to come here, though, on The Real Stories, Americans continue to mourn the loss of former President Jimmy Carter. Connecticut remembers him as a submariner and the couple which fueled Habitat for Humanity's work. We're talking more about Carter's local legacy next.